The crystal glasses clinked as 70-year-old Edward Harrington stood in the corner of his son's sprawling living room. The party buzzed with laughter and conversation, but he felt invisible, until he wasn't. "Another drink, Edward?" Clara's voice cut through the ambient noise as she approached, her ruby-red dress catching the light from the chandelier he had installed 15 years ago. "No, thank you. One is enough," he replied, his weathered hands gripping the half-empty glass. Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. Always so. Modest. She turned to the circle of guests beside them. "My father-in-law believes in moderation in all things, including joy." A ripple of polite laughter followed. Edward felt his cheeks warm but maintained his composure. His late wife, Eleanor, had always said, "Dignity costs nothing, but is worth everything." Speaking of modest, Clara continued, louder now, drawing more attention. "We've been thinking about moving. This place is lovely, but it's so dated." The room quieted slightly. Everyone knew this was Edward's family home, the one he had given to his son Nathaniel when he married Clara 5 years ago. The kitchen alone would need a complete overhaul. Clara waved her hand dismissively. "Who designs countertops that low anyway? And those old-fashioned cabinets?" Edward's throat tightened. Eleanor had designed that kitchen. They'd saved for years to build it just as she wanted. "The plumbing makes these horrible noises too," Clara added with a theatrical shudder. "Like living with ghosts." More laughter, less polite this time. More pointed. "I told Nathaniel, why are we still living in this old man's house? We make enough now to build something that actually reflects us, not his parents' taste from the Stone Age." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Eyes darted between Edward and Clara. Edward looked across the room to where his son Nathaniel stood by the fireplace, drink in hand. Their eyes met. Nathaniel's gaze dropped to the floor. He said nothing. The silence stretched like an elastic band about to snap. "Excuse me," Edward murmured, setting his glass down carefully on a side table. "I believe I should head home." "Already?" Clara's voice dripped with false concern. "It's barely 9. I'm sure you'll have more fun without an old relic hanging around," Edward said quietly, his words carrying in the hushed room. As he moved toward the door, he heard Clara's voice behind him. "See? So sensitive. This is exactly why we need our own space." More laughter erupted, but it sounded hollow now. Forced. At the door, Edward glanced back. Nathaniel still hadn't moved from his spot by the fireplace. He was staring into his drink, shoulders slightly hunched. Edward walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The night air felt cool against his burning face. The stars above were bright and cold. He stood for a moment on the porch where he'd taught Nathaniel to tie his shoes, where they'd built model rockets together, where they'd sat in silence after Eleanor's funeral. He looked back at the house, his house, now filled with people who saw him as nothing but an outdated inconvenience. The laughter inside swelled again. Through the window, Edward could see Clara holding court, her hands animated as she spoke. Nathaniel stood beside her now, his arm around her waist, a smile fixed on his face. Edward turned away, his steps heavy as he walked to his car. His son had watched while his wife insulted him at the party, and said nothing. The engine hummed as Edward guided his old Volvo through the empty streets. Street lights cast golden pools on the asphalt, flickering across the windshield in rhythmic patterns. He drove slowly, in no hurry to reach his small apartment across town. The radio remained off. Edward preferred the silence. It gave him space to think, to process what had just happened at the party. This old man's house, Clara had called it, as if the 30 years of love, memories, and care he'd poured into those walls meant nothing, as if it were just an outdated container to be discarded. A red light stopped him at an intersection. Edward stared at the glowing signal, remembering Eleanor's face when they'd first walked through that front door as owners. The mortgage had been steep, the renovations endless, but she'd seen the potential. "We'll grow old in this house," she'd promised, squeezing his hand. "We'll fill it with noise and love, and then watch it all quiet down again when we're gray." But Eleanor never got gray. Cancer took her when Nathaniel was just 15, leaving Edward to raise their son alone in the suddenly too quiet house. The light turned green. Edward pressed the accelerator gently. "Dignity costs nothing, and it's worth everything," Eleanor used to say. He'd tried to live by those words, especially after she was gone. He'd tried to teach Nathaniel the same. What had happened to that quiet, thoughtful boy who used to follow him around the workshop, asking questions about how things worked? When had he become this silent man who wouldn't stand up for his own father? Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. The wipers squeaked across the windshield. Edward thought about the kitchen Clara had mocked. Eleanor had designed every inch of it, insisting on lower countertops because she was petite. Why should I have to stand on tiptoes in my own kitchen? She'd argued. The cabinets she'd called old-fashioned had been handcrafted by Eleanor's father, a gift when they'd finally finished renovating. Each detail in that house had a story, a purpose. But Clara saw none of it. And worse, Nathaniel had forgotten. Edward turned onto Oak Street, passing the park where he'd taught Nathaniel to ride a bike. The memory was vivid. His son's determined little face, the wobbling handlebars, the triumphant whoop when he finally balanced on his own. "You're not holding on anymore," Nathaniel had shouted. "I don't need to," Edward had answered. "You've got this on your own." The irony wasn't lost on him now. As he approached his apartment building, Edward felt something shift inside him. The hurt was still there, but something else was emerging alongside it. Something harder, more resolved. He parked the car and sat for a moment, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Clara's laughter echoed in his memory, followed by the crushing silence of his son's betrayal. "Where did we lose each other?" Edward whispered to the empty car. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m., not even 10 o'clock, and he'd been driven from the home he'd built with his own hands. Edward reached for his wallet and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Eleanor holding 3-year-old Nathaniel on her lap, both grinning at the camera. He'd taken that picture on the back porch of the house, their house, during a summer barbecue. He traced their faces with his fingertip, then carefully returned the photo to his wallet. That night, something in Edward changed, something he didn't even recognize yet. The hurt was transforming, hardening into resolve. He grabbed his umbrella and stepped out into the rain. Edward's apartment felt empty compared to the house he'd built. Just one bedroom, a small living area, and a kitchenette. But it was enough since he'd moved out to give Nathaniel and Clara space after their wedding. He hung his coat and moved to his study. Really just a corner of the living room with a desk and bookshelf. Photographs lined the wall above his desk. Eleanor holding baby Nathaniel. Nathaniel's high school graduation. The three of them camping by Lake Taconic when Nathaniel was 10. Edward sank into his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a leather-bound album Eleanor had started. She'd labeled it Our Life in her flowing script. The first page showed them young, standing in front of the house on the day they bought it. The paint was peeling, the yard overgrown, but they were beaming with pride. "It needs work," Eleanor had said, "but so does anything worth having." Edward turned the pages slowly. Eleanor gardening, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun. Nathaniel taking his first steps across the living room hardwood floors. Edward had restored himself. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, life captured in fading photographs. He paused at a picture of Eleanor at her piano, the same one still sitting in the living room of their old home. She'd played every evening after dinner, filling the house with Chopin and Bach. After she died, the piano sat silent for months until Edward forced himself to dust it weekly, keeping it ready as if she might return. Her garden gloves still hung on a peg by the back door, too. He couldn't bring himself to move them, even after 5 years. Did Clara even know whose gloves they were, or did she see them as just another outdated item to be tossed? Edward flipped to Nathaniel's teen years, the hardest time, after losing Eleanor. The boy's smile had disappeared for a while. Edward had tried everything to bring it back. There they were rebuilding the old Mustang in the garage, oil-stained and focused. Edward had bought the junker specifically to give them a project together, something to talk about when words otherwise failed. Mom would have hated all this mess in her garage, Nathaniel had said one day, the first time he'd mentioned Eleanor without his voice cracking. She would have pretended to hate it, Edward had corrected, but secretly taken photos of us working. They'd both laughed, and something had healed a little between them. Edward turned another page, Nathaniel's college graduation. Edward standing alone beside his son in his cap and gown, both smiling but something missing from the frame. Edward had paid for that education with the money he and Eleanor had saved for their retirement. He'd never told Nathaniel that part. "Your future matters more," he'd said when Nathaniel worried about the expensive private university. Your mom would want this. After graduation, Nathaniel had taken a job in finance, met Clara at a company event, fallen hard and fast for her confidence and ambition. Edward closed the album when he reached the wedding photos. He couldn't look at them tonight. Couldn't see himself standing proudly next to the son who'd watched silently as his wife tore down his father. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. "Where did we lose each other, son?" Edward whispered. He ran his hand over the album cover, feeling the texture beneath his fingers. All these sacrifices, all these memories. His decision to give them the house had been out of love, wanting them to build their own story within those walls that had sheltered so much life already. Instead, Clara saw only an old house in need of updating, and Nathaniel. Nathaniel had forgotten what those walls contained. Edward stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slick street below. Across town, his house, his real home, probably still hummed with party guests. Were they all laughing at the old man who'd left early? Was Nathaniel relieved he was gone? He pressed his hand against the cold glass, watching his breath fog the window. "I gave him everything, Eleanor," he whispered. "Everything we built together." The silence that answered felt heavier tonight. Edward turned back to his desk and noticed the deed to the house, still in his name. He'd been meaning to transfer it formally to Nathaniel's name for years, but somehow never got around to it. Just an oversight, he'd told himself. Just procrastination. Now, he wondered if something deeper had held him back. Edward picked up the deed, the paper crinkling under his fingers. "Dignity costs nothing," he murmured. "But this house? This house cost everything." Morning light spilled through the kitchen window of Edward's apartment as he made coffee. Sleep had been elusive, his mind replaying Clara's words and Nathaniel's silence on loop throughout the night. His phone had remained silent. No call from Nathaniel checking if he'd gotten home safely. No message apologizing for Clara's behavior. Just silence. The kind of silence that spoke volumes. Edward stirred honey into his coffee, a habit Eleanor had started him on years ago. "Sugar is for people with no patience," she'd always said. "Honey takes time to stir in, but it's worth the wait." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Violet, his neighbor from across the hall. Early 60s, silver-streaked hair always pulled into a practical bun, kind eyes behind purple-framed glasses. "Morning, Edward. Brought your mail." She handed him a small stack. "It was sitting outside your door. You must have missed it yesterday." "Thanks, Vi. Want some coffee?" "Can't today. Grandkids coming over." She hesitated. "You okay? You look like you didn't sleep." Edward managed to smile. Just one of those nights. After she left, Edward flipped through the mail. Bills. Advertisements. A letter from his old colleague Rufus. And tucked between them, a thick cream envelope with Harrington residence, written in familiar handwriting, Clara's handwriting. Edward sat down at his small kitchen table, coffee cooling beside him, and opened the envelope. Inside was a realtor's brochure for luxury homes in Oak Ridge Heights, the new development across town. Clipped to it was a note in Clara's looping script. "Can't wait to move somewhere modern. This old place feels like a museum. Looking at these on Tuesday. Don't mention to Edward yet." Edward stared at the note, reading it 3 times to make sure he understood. They were already planning to move, already looking at houses, and specifically keeping it from him. He set the note beside his coffee cup, studying it like a man looking at a declaration of war. The brochure showed gleaming modern homes with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist architecture, nothing like the craftsman-style home he and Eleanor had lovingly restored. The prices made his eyes widen. Even with Nathaniel's good salary, these would be a stretch. Unless they were counting on selling his house. The house he still legally owned. Edward's hand shook slightly as he picked up his coffee. The honey had settled at the bottom, too long neglected to properly mix. He took out his phone and pulled up the last text exchange with Nathaniel. 3 weeks ago, his son had asked to borrow his toolbox. Nothing since. Edward typed slowly. "Need to talk about the house. Can you stop by today?" The response came surprisingly quickly. "Busy today. Work deadline." "Tomorrow?" Edward typed back. "Tomorrow works. Noon at my apartment. Can't we do dinner at our place instead? Clara's making pasta." Our place. As if Edward had never lived there. As if he hadn't built the deck they ate dinner on during summer evenings. Noon. My place. Important. Edward sent the message and set his phone down. He picked up Clara's note again, rereading the words that had transformed his sadness into something harder, more resolute. This old place feels like a museum. A museum. A place where old things go to be observed but not lived with. Not appreciated for their function, only their historical value. And Edward folded the note carefully and slipped it into his wallet, right behind the photo of Eleanor and Nathaniel. Then he pulled out the house deed from his desk drawer again, running his fingers over the embossed seal. Both his and Eleanor's names were listed as owners. With her gone, the property was solely his. That's when he remembered. This house isn't theirs to sell. Edward reached for his phone again, but not to text Nathaniel. Instead, he scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in years. Philip Blackwood, his attorney who had handled Eleanor's estate. His finger hovered over the call button for just a moment before pressing it. Philip? Edward Harrington here. I need your help with something. How soon can we meet? As he spoke, Edward looked at the realtor's brochure once more, at the gleaming modern houses that represented everything his home was not. Clara wanted modern. He would give her something truly unexpected instead. Philip Blackwood's office hadn't changed in the 15 years Edward had known him. The same leather chairs, the same mahogany desk, even the same landscape paintings on the walls. It was comforting in its constancy. Edward, good to see you, Philip said, rising from his desk to shake hands. His silver hair was thinner, but his grip remained firm. Though I must admit, your call surprised me. Edward settled into the chair across from him. Life is full of surprises lately. So, Philip said, folding his hands on the desk, you want to sell your house? The one Nathaniel and Clara are living in? Yes, the one you've been meaning to transfer to Nathaniel's name for 5 years. Edward nodded. The very one. Philip leaned back, studying Edward's face. May I ask why now? And why sell rather than transfer? Edward placed Clara's note on the desk and slid it across. Philip read it, his eyebrows rising slightly. I see. He handed it back. And Nathaniel? What does he say about this? Nothing. He says nothing. Edward's voice was calm, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests. He stood there while his wife mocked me in my own home, while she dismissed 30 years of my life as outdated and irrelevant. Philip nodded slowly. I understand the hurt, Edward. But selling the house, it's a big step, one that can't easily be undone. I'm aware. And you're prepared for the fallout? Family relationships can be. What family relationship? Edward interrupted, his voice still quiet but edged with steel. My son watches his wife insult me and says nothing. He plans to sell my house behind my back. Tell me, Philip, what exactly am I? Preserving by staying silent? The attorney sighed, removing his glasses to polish them with a handkerchief. You make a fair point. Edward opened his briefcase and pulled out the yellowed house deed, placing it on the desk. No transfer, a full sale. To whom? These things take time. Finding a buyer, I already have one in mind. Philip raised an eyebrow. That was quick. Edward's mouth curved in the slightest smile. I've had a standing offer for years. Never considered it until now. May I ask who? Gregory Tennyson. Recognition flashed in Philip's eyes. The developer? The one who's been buying up properties around your neighborhood for that community project? Edward nodded. The Eleanor Grayson Foundation. Named after his sister. Eleanor? Like your wife? They were friends in college. He approached me years ago about using the property, but I wasn't ready. Edward's voice softened. Eleanor always talked about creating a place for women starting over, widows, single mothers, people who needed a fresh start with dignity. Philip leaned forward. And you're ready now? To let go of the house? I'm ready to see it used for something meaningful, Edward said, not treated like an embarrassing relic. And Nathaniel and Clara? What about them? Edward's expression hardened again. They want a modern house. They'll have the money to buy one. Philip studied him for a long moment. You'll regret this, Edward. Family doesn't stand silent when you're being torn down, Edward interrupted. Family remembers where they came from. The calmness in his voice felt unnatural, the stillness before a storm. His hand tightened around the deed. I already regret many things, Philip. Giving too much, expecting too little in return. Edward met his old friend's gaze steadily. But this I won't regret. Philip nodded slowly, accepting defeat. I'll draw up the papers, discreetly, as you asked. But Edward, consider giving them some warning. Tomorrow. I'll tell Nathaniel tomorrow. Edward stood, extending his hand. How soon can it be done? If the buyer is ready? 2 weeks, perhaps less. Edward nodded. He's ready. He's been ready for years. As he walked to the door, Philip called after him. Edward, are you certain about this? Edward paused, his hand on the doorknob. The afternoon light caught the gold of his wedding band, still worn after all these years. Some things should be preserved, Philip. Some things should be honored. He turned back, his expression calm but determined. My dignity is one of them. The door closed softly behind him, the quiet click more final than any slam. The next day, Nathaniel arrived at Edward's apartment precisely at noon. No Clara, just father and son, sitting across from each other at Edward's small kitchen table, an untouched pot of coffee between them. You wanted to talk about the house? Nathaniel asked, checking his watch subtly. Always in a hurry these days. Edward studied his son's face, Eleanor's eyes, his jaw, their shared stubbornness. Yes, Edward said simply. I wanted to let you know I've decided to sell it. The words hung in the air between them. Nathaniel blinked, processing. Sell it, but we live there. For now. Nathaniel's confusion shifted toward anger. What does that mean? For now. Dad, that's our home. Is it? Edward kept his voice level. Funny, Clara called it this old man's house just the other night. Color rose in Nathaniel's cheeks. She didn't mean, she meant exactly what she said, Edward interrupted. And you stood there and let her say it? Nathaniel looked down at his untouched coffee. It was just party talk. She'd had a few drinks. And the realtor brochures? The plans to move somewhere, modern? Was that just party talk too? Nathaniel's head snapped up. How did you? She sent it to the house. My house. The one with my name still on the deed. Edward's calm was unsettling even to, and himself. The one you were planning to sell without consulting me. We weren't. It wasn't. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Eleanor it made Edward's chest tighten. We were just looking at options. So am I. Nathaniel leaned forward. Dad, be reasonable. Where would we go on such short notice? I'm giving you 2 weeks. The beautiful homes in that brochure Clara likes should still be available. Father and son stared at each other across the table. The silence stretched, taut with unspoken words. You can't do this, Nathaniel finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. I already have. The following days passed in uncomfortable silence. Edward returned to the house, his house, each morning after Nathaniel left for work. He sat in Eleanor's garden, walked through the rooms, remembering. Clara noticed the changes immediately. The realtor visits, the papers Edward reviewed at the kitchen table, his quiet phone calls in the study. What's happening? She asked Nathaniel one evening, watching Edward pruning roses in the garden from the kitchen window. He's here every day now, moving things, taking photos. It's creepy. Nathaniel didn't answer. 3 days after their talk, Edward brought in Marissa Tang, a petite woman with clipboard and measuring tape who introduced herself as the project designer. Project designer for what? Clara demanded, intercepting them in the hallway. Just some renovations, Edward replied with a politeness that didn't reach his eyes. Clara cornered Nathaniel in their bedroom that night. He's planning something. You need to talk to him. Nathaniel stared at the ceiling. He's selling the house. What? Clara sat up straight. He can't do that. Apparently, he can. But we live here. This is our home. Nathaniel turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. This old man's house, I think you called it. Clara's face flushed. You know I didn't mean, didn't you? Nathaniel cut her off, then rolled over to face the wall, ending the conversation. The following morning, Edward arrived with Gregory Tennyson, a tall man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. They walked the property together, talking in low voices, nodding and occasionally making notes. Clara watched from the window, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Who is that man? She asked when Nathaniel came downstairs. No idea. This is ridiculous, Clara hissed. Your father can't just sell our home out from under us. Nathaniel poured himself coffee. Legally, it's still his house. And morally? Ethically? What kind of father does this to his own son? Nathaniel didn't answer, but his hands shook slightly as he stirred his coffee. Over breakfast, Edward left a note on the counter. Please be home at 4 p.m. on Friday. We need to discuss the house. Clara read it and crumpled it in her fist. He's enjoying this, isn't he? Playing the wounded party. But beneath her anger, something else flickered. The first stirrings of real worry. Edward's quiet determination was more unsettling than any shouting match would have been. For the next 2 days, the house filled with unusual activity. Measurements were taken. Furniture was catalogued. Edward worked methodically, making notes, taking photos of each room. Through it all, he remained unfailingly polite. He made breakfast each morning before they woke up, left it warming in the oven, cleaned up after himself. But beneath his civility, something sharp and deliberate grew, like a blade being slowly, carefully honed. Clara could feel something shifting, like the calm before thunder. Friday arrived with a weight of inevitability. Edward came early, dressed in a crisp blue shirt and khaki pants, the same outfit he'd worn to Nathaniel's college graduation. A deliberate choice. He prepared a proper tea with Eleanor's favorite china set, finger sandwiches, scones, small details that spoke volumes. At precisely 4 p.m., the doorbell rang. Clara and Nathaniel had been quiet all morning, moving around each other like wary cats. They sat in the living room now, dressed as if for an important meeting. Clara's red fingernails tapped against her knee in an anxious rhythm. Edward opened the door to reveal Philip Blackwood and Gregory Tennyson, both carrying leather portfolios. Right on time, Edward said, ushering them in. Please, join us in the living room. Confusion flickered across Clara's face when she saw the strangers. She'd expected a realtor, perhaps, but not this distinguished older gentleman and the tall, kind-eyed man who followed. Nathaniel, Clara, Edward said formally, "This is my attorney, Philip Blackwood, and Gregory Tennyson, founder of the Eleanor Grayson Foundation." The names hung in the air, unrecognized but heavy with significance. Foundation? Clara echoed. What foundation? Gregory stepped forward. The Eleanor Grayson Foundation provides housing and support for widowed women and single mothers rebuilding their lives. His voice was gentle but firm. We've been hoping to establish a residence in this area for some time. Clara's eyes narrowed as understanding began to dawn. And what does that have to do with us? Edward nodded to Philip, who opened his portfolio and removed a thick document bound with a blue cover. This is the final sale agreement for this property, Philip explained, his tone professionally neutral. All parties have agreed to terms. We just need the final signatures today. You sold this house? Clara's voice rose, her composure cracking. I did, Edward said softly, because it was never yours to begin with. Nathaniel stood frozen beside the fireplace, the same spot where he'd stood silently during the party. Clara's fury visibly rose as she processed what was happening. You can't do this, she hissed. We live here. The sale includes a generous relocation allowance, Philip interjected smoothly. More than enough to secure new housing in the outlying areas you've been researching. He glanced meaningfully at the realtor's brochure, still sitting on the coffee table. Clara turned to Nathaniel. Are you going to say anything? He's throwing us out of our home. Edward shook his head slowly. Not throwing you out, letting you go. His eyes fixed on Nathaniel, freeing you to have that modern home you both clearly want. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Dad, this house, it has our memories. Does it? Edward asked quietly. Do you remember your mother designing that kitchen Clara finds so outdated? Do you remember building that deck together the summer you were 16? Do you remember the stories in these walls at all? Nathaniel swallowed hard. Of course I do. Yet, you stood there silently while Clara mocked it all. Edward's voice remained calm, but his eyes held decades of disappointment. You watched her insult everything your mother and I built, and you said nothing. Clara stepped between them. This is about me, isn't it? You're punishing me. No, Clara. This isn't punishment. It's consequence. Edward turned to Gregory. This house was built with love. It deserves to be filled with it again. Gregory nodded. We plan to accommodate 6 families initially. The renovation will preserve the character of the home while adapting it to serve these women and children. Clara laughed bitterly. So this is your revenge? Turning your son's home into a shelter? No, Edward said, his gaze steady. This is my wife's legacy, the one I should have honored years ago. Philip cleared his throat, always the professional. The terms are quite generous. Full market value, plus 20%, the relocation allowance, and an additional 90 days to find suitable new accommodation, if needed. Clara stared at the contract, her hands trembling with rage. This is insane. Nathaniel, do something. But Nathaniel was looking at his father with new eyes, seeing not the mild-mannered man who had raised him, but someone with an unexpected steel core. The kitchen counters, Nathaniel said suddenly. Mom designed them lower because she was petite. Edward nodded, surprised. She did. And the cabinets. Grandpa made those. By hand. Took him 3 months. Nathaniel ran his fingers along the wooden mantel. I never told Clara those stories. Perhaps you should have. Edward's voice softened slightly. Perhaps then she would have understood what she was dismissing. Clara looked between them, sensing the shift in the conversation. This is still our home. It was my home, Edward corrected gently. The home I shared with my wife. The home where I raised my son. I gave you both the gift of living here, but you treated it like an embarrassing hand-me-down. And us? He took the contract from Philip and placed it on the coffee table. The sale is final. The papers just need my signature to close. I wanted you both to hear it from me first. Clara sank onto the sofa, her composure finally breaking. Where are we supposed to go? Wherever you want, Edward replied. That's the point. You wanted something modern, something that reflects you. Now you'll have the means to find exactly that. He picked up a pen and signed the document with a steady hand, each stroke deliberate. I'm not throwing you out, he said again, looking directly at his son. I'm letting you go. The moving truck arrived exactly 14 days later, blocking the driveway of the craftsman home on Maple Street. Men in uniform carried boxes and furniture while neighbors watched curiously from behind curtains and over garden fences. Edward stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, watching. He wasn't supervising or directing, just observing the dismantling of one chapter and the beginning of another. Clara hadn't spoken to him since the day of the sale. She'd refused to be present for the moving day, leaving for her mother's house the previous evening with a cold goodbye to Nathaniel and nothing for Edward. Nathaniel worked alongside the movers, directing which items went where, occasionally pausing to wipe sweat from his brow in the late morning heat. His movements were efficient but heavy, weighted with unresolved emotions. Edward remained where he was, neither helping nor hindering. The distance between father and son stretched wider than the physical space separating them. A mover approached Nathaniel with questions about a large armoire, Eleanor's armoire. Nathaniel hesitated, clearly uncertain. South wall of the master bedroom, Edward called out, his voice carrying across the lawn. It needs to be taken apart first. The back panel comes off with those small brass screws. Nathaniel looked over, surprised. Their eyes met briefly before he nodded to the mover, confirming his father's instructions. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the house gradually emptied. Furniture that had graced its rooms for decades now sat exposed on the front lawn, awaiting transport. Paintings left ghostly rectangles on the walls where they'd hung for years. Around 2 o'clock, Nathaniel approached Edward for the first time, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. Thought you might be thirsty, he said, offering one. Edward accepted with a nod. They stood in awkward silence, watching the movers work. You could have told me, Nathaniel finally said, about the foundation, about what Mom wanted to do with the house. Edward sipped his lemonade. Would it have mattered? Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe. You had 5 years to ask about the stories in this house, to share them with Clara. Edward's voice wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. You chose not to, I thought. Nathaniel struggled to find the words. I thought moving forward meant leaving the past behind. The past isn't a burden to be discarded, son. It's the foundation we build upon. Edward gestured toward the house. Like this place, strong bones, good structure. It could have evolved with you, if you'd honored what came before. Nathaniel studied his shoes. Clara wanted something that felt like ours, not inherited. And now you'll have it. Edward's tone remained neutral. Sometimes we need to lose something to understand its value. The conversation faded into silence again. A comfortable silence this time, tinged with resignation rather than anger. By late afternoon, the truck was loaded. Just a few personal items remained to be collected. Nathaniel did a final walkthrough of the empty house, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors his father had restored by hand decades earlier. Edward waited outside, watching the changing light play across the facade he'd painted 16 times over 30 years. When Nathaniel emerged, he carried a small cardboard box. "I found these in the attic," he said, opening it to reveal old photo albums, duplicates of ones Edward had. "Thought you might want them." Edward shook his head. "Keep them. Your children should know where they came from, even if it's not where they're going." Something flashed across Nathaniel's face, surprise, perhaps realization. "Clara's pregnant," he said abruptly. "We were going to announce it at that party, but—" Edward's composed exterior cracked slightly. "A grandchild. Eleanor would have been overjoyed." "Congratulations," he said simply, extending his hand. Nathaniel hesitated, then bypassed the hand to embrace his father awkwardly. It was brief, stiff with unresolved feelings, but it was something. "I'll call you once we're settled," Nathaniel said as he pulled away. Edward nodded, not quite believing it but willing to pretend. "I'd like that." The final items were loaded. Nathaniel climbed into his car, the last to leave. He paused with the door open, looking back at his father standing alone on the sidewalk. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely audible across the distance between them. "For what Clara said. For not speaking up." Edward acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Drive safely." As the car pulled away, Edward walked to the gate of the property, his property for just a few more days. He locked it gently behind him, an act of quiet finality. No yelling, no revenge speech, just quiet closure. Edward stood for a moment, watching Nathaniel's car disappear down the street. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn where he'd taught his son to play catch, where Eleanor had planted daffodils that still bloomed each spring. But this story wasn't about revenge anymore. 3 weeks passed. The sold sign in front of the Craftsman house came down. Construction vehicles appeared instead, not demolition equipment as some neighbors had feared, but careful renovation crews. Workers moved with unexpected reverence, preserving original features while updating others. Edward visited daily, consulting with Gregory Tennyson and Marissa Tang as the Eleanor Grayson Foundation took shape within the bones of his former home. "The east bedroom gets the best morning light," he told Marissa as they walked through the empty rooms. "Eleanor used to say it was like waking up in liquid gold." Marissa made notes. "Perfect for the mother with the newborn." Then, "Gentle waking light." Edward nodded, pleased. "And the window seat in the second bedroom?" "We're keeping it," Gregory assured him. "All the window seats. They're perfect reading nooks for the children." They continued through the house, Edward sharing memories, the others translating them into new purpose. The kitchen was being expanded, but Clara's hated, outdated cabinets were being carefully preserved and restored. Eleanor's piano would remain in the living room, soon to be joined by comfortable seating for group counseling sessions. The transformation was happening with surprising speed, fueled by donations that seemed to materialize overnight once word of the project spread. What nobody knew, what Edward had insisted, remain confidential, was where the initial funding had come from. The sale price of the house had been deposited directly into the foundation's accounts, not Edward's. Every penny he'd received for his family home had gone back into transforming it for its new purpose. Edward hadn't told anyone this part. Not Gregory, not Philip, certainly not Nathaniel. This wasn't about recognition. 1 week later, a local news crew arrived. The foundation was gaining attention as a model of community support. Gregory had arranged the coverage to help with additional fundraising. Edward stayed in the background as Gregory explained the mission to the young reporter. The Eleanor Grayson Foundation provides transitional housing for women rebuilding their lives, Gregory explained. Each resident will receive not just shelter, but counseling, job training, and childcare. "And why this location?" the reporter asked, gesturing to the charming Craftsman house. Gregory glanced at Edward, who gave a slight nod. "This house was donated by a local resident who wished to honor his late wife's dream," Gregory said simply. "Eleanor Grayson was my sister, but she was also a visionary who believed in second chances. Before cancer took her, she and her husband had discussed creating exactly this kind of sanctuary." The reporter's interest visibly sharpened. "So the owner just gave away his home for this cause?" "The owner," Gregory said carefully, "believed some homes are meant to shelter souls, not egos." The camera panned to Edward, who had moved to tend Eleanor's rose garden, now expanded to wrap around a new children's playground. He looked up, nodded politely at the camera, then returned to his pruning. The news segment aired that evening on local television. By morning, it had been picked up by national networks, dubbed an act of generational grace by one commentator. Donations flooded in. Volunteers appeared, offering services. Edward watched the coverage from his small apartment, surprised by the attention. His phone rang repeatedly. Old friends, former colleagues, neighbors who'd never spoken to him before. He answered none of them. The only call he waited for never came. Until 3 days later, Edward was at the house, helping install bookshelves in what would become a library, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Dad? Clara's voice, surprising him more than the call itself. Clara, he acknowledged, setting down his tools. Is everything all right, Nathaniel? Is fine, she cut in. We're both fine. We saw the news. Edward said nothing, waiting. You gave away the money, she continued, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. The wholesale price. They're saying you donated everything to the foundation. Are they? Edward kept his voice neutral. Did you? A direct question, very Clara. What would it matter if I did? A pause. It would mean you weren't selling the house for money, or to punish us. I told you then, Clara. It wasn't about punishment. Another pause, longer this time. The realtor who sold us our new house. She said the additional funds came from an anonymous donor, 20% above our offer, exactly when we were about to lose the bid. Edward smiled slightly, glad she couldn't see his face. How fortunate. Was it you? Clara pressed. Would it matter if it was? The line went quiet for so long. Edward thought she'd hung up. Then, Nathaniel wants to talk to you. About the baby. About everything. Edward's heart quickened slightly. I'd like that. He's stubborn, Clara said, a hint of her old directness returning. Like his father. Like his mother. Edward corrected gently. A sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. The house. It looks beautiful in the news footage. What they're doing with it. It does. I didn't understand, Clara said finally. What it meant to you. What it represented. No, Edward agreed. You didn't. Nathaniel never told me the stories. About the countertops. The cabinets. No, Edward said again. He didn't. One final pause. He's telling them to me now. After the call ended, Edward returned to his shelves, working with renewed purpose. The foundation would open in 3 weeks. 6 families were already selected for the initial program. Eleanor would have been proud, not of his moment of anger, selling the house to make a point, but of what had grown from that impulse. Something healing, something hopeful. The news reports called it an act of generational grace. Edward simply called it setting things right. Opening day arrived with perfect autumn weather. Sunshine filtered through golden leaves, casting dappled light across the new sign in front of the Craftsman House, the Eleanor Grayson Foundation, a place of new beginnings. Edward arrived early, and before the crowds. He wanted one final quiet walk through the transformed space before it officially became something new. Gregory met him at the gate with a set of keys. You should do the honors, he said, pressing them into Edward's palm. Edward opened the gate he'd installed 40 years earlier, now freshly painted a warm blue, Eleanor's favorite color. The front garden had been expanded, with benches placed strategically beneath shade trees. A small playground gleamed with new equipment on what had once been their side lawn. The front door, the original oak door he'd restored the year Nathaniel was born, now bore a small brass plaque with Eleanor's name. Edward ran his fingers over the engraved letters before unlocking it. Inside, the house had been transformed, yet preserved. The entryway opened into a bright reception area, but the original hardwood floors remained, refinished to a warm glow. Eleanor's stained glass window still cast colored light across the space. Edward moved through each room slowly, noting the changes and constants. The library with floor-to-ceiling shelves. The expanded kitchen with its preserved custom cabinets. The sunroom now set up as a children's play area. The dining room transformed into a meeting space. And everywhere, touches of Eleanor. Her favorite colors in the upholstery. Her gardening books displayed on shelves. Photos of her roses framed in the hallway. You did her proud, Gregory said quietly, following a few steps behind. Edward nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He climbed the stairs to what had been the master bedroom, now divided into 2 comfortable apartments for mothers with infants. The morning light streamed in just as it always had. Liquid gold, as Eleanor used to say. "Mr. Harrington?" A soft voice called from the doorway. Marissa Tang stood there with a young woman beside her. "This is Zoe, one of our first residents. She and her daughter arrive tomorrow." The young woman stepped forward tentatively, no more than 25, with tired eyes but a determined set to her jaw. "Mr. Tennyson told me this was your home," she said. "I wanted to thank you for this chance." Edward extended his hand. "It's Eleanor you should thank. This was her dream. I wish I could have met her," Zoe said simply. "So do I," Edward replied. "She would have liked you." By mid-morning, the house filled with people. The mayor came for the ribbon cutting. Donors arrived with additional checks. Volunteers organized refreshments on the back deck Edward and Nathaniel had built together. Edward kept to the edges of the gathering, watching as the house absorbed this new energy, these new purposes. It felt right somehow. A home meant for family becoming a home for many families. He was so absorbed in his observations that he almost missed their arrival. Nathaniel, slightly thinner than before, holding Clara's hand. Clara, with the slight roundness of early pregnancy visible beneath her dress. They stood hesitantly at the entrance to the garden. Edward walked slowly toward them, stopping a few feet away. "You came," he said simply. Nathaniel nodded. "We wanted to see it, to understand." "And?" Edward asked. "It's beautiful," Clara said, with surprising gentleness. "It feels right somehow." Edward looked between them, noting the subtle changes, a new humility in Clara's bearing, a new steadiness in Nathaniel's gaze. "Would you like a tour?" he offered. They nodded, and Edward led them through the house, through its transformation. He shared stories as they walked, not of his own pain or their mistakes, but of Eleanor, of the home they'd built, of the legacy now taking shape. In the library, Nathaniel paused before a photograph of Eleanor in her garden. "I've been thinking," he said hesitantly. "If it's a girl, we'd like to name her Eleanor." Edward stopped, his hand on a bookshelf to steady himself. "Your mother would have been honored," he managed, finally. Clara touched his arm lightly. "And we'd like you to be part of her life. A real part." Edward nodded, not trusting words. Later, after they'd gone, after the crowds had thinned, Edward walked through the garden one last time. The first families would arrive tomorrow. The house would begin its new chapter. At the gate, he turned for a final look. The setting sun painted the old craftsman home in warm amber light, making it glow like a beacon. "Eleanor," he whispered, "we finally did it." Across town, Clara scrolled through her phone in their new modern home, all clean lines and open spaces. She paused on a news headline about the foundation's opening, showing Edward standing quietly by the garden gate. Nathaniel read over her shoulder. The silence between them said everything that needed saying. Edward walked away from the house as dawn broke, his silhouette small but strong against the light. He carried with him not bitterness or regret, but a sense of completion. The circle had closed, a new one had begun. As he reached his car, he thought of something Eleanor had told him once, when he'd worried about confronting a difficult situation. "Never mistake kindness for weakness," she'd said. He hadn't understood then what she meant. 40 years later, walking away from the house that had sheltered his entire adult life, he finally did. Edward started his car and drove toward the future, leaving behind not just a house, but a legacy.